Hello, we're here today with internationally known MIT linguist Noam Chomsky, co-author of a recent Science article on the evolution of language. That article is entitled "The Faculty of Language. What is it, who has it, and how did it evolve?" Professor Chomsky, in your long writings about the nature of language, acquisition of language by individuals has played an important part in your thinking, and you've commented on it in depth, its nature and its significance. On the other hand, the acquisition of language by our species seems to be a new topic for you, one you haven't talked about in detail before. Are you excited about this? And give us a little bit of background on your engagement in the topic.
Well, from my point of view, it became, it's not lack of interest, it's just that I've never seen anything that could be said about it. It's both too hard and too easy. It's too easy because it is so easy to make up all sorts of possible scenarios. In fact, just they come to mind instantly, and a lot of them are in the literature. It's too hard because there's no way to tell whether any of them have any plausibility, let alone or credibility. The problem, in my view, has always been to try to parcel out the topic in such a way that at least parts of it can be studied. And that's essentially what this is about. Actually, it doesn't say anything about the evolution of language. It just says, here's a way of looking at the topic with various components, some of which can be investigated by the comparative method, which is about the only successful method, some of which might be very significant if certain ideas about the nature, recent ideas about the nature of language are correct. So if it turns out that, in fact, in some interesting sense, the computational system of the core computational system has optimization properties, in particular that it's something like an optimal solution to the problem of linking interface conditions. If that's true, then there are many avenues to explore that could turn out to be interesting. They're kind of barely mentioned at the end. So there are other optimization strategies and processes known in nature, and it's conceivable that this could be one of them, in which case, matter of things as remote as, say, insect navigation or foraging strategies or the distribution of the structure of the circulatory system, which optimizes in a certain sense, could turn out to be relevant to the evolution of language. The interface systems, it's possible that here's mostly Mark Hauser and Tecumseh Fitch's work. I don't know anything about it. That they've done a lot of work on primates and even beyond, trying to investigate to what extent sensory motor systems and harder question, conceptual systems in other primates might have, or beyond in fact, might have might be homologous to humans in some respect. But that is a topic that at least can be studied by comparative approaches. And if it's true that the fundamental nature of language involves interface conditions, which are mostly there independently of language. Maybe they were partly selected for language functions. If it involves interface conditions and something like optimization relative to interface conditions, which is a highly speculative idea, if that's true, then at least you can break the problem into parts that can be addressed in ways that are to some extent understood.
You seem to arrange the proposal that you make in the paper between two different poles of thinking about this topic. One is that human language is basically analogous to things found in the animal world, maybe more difficult, more complex, but not different in kind. And the other is that it's completely unique, a completely unique human adaptation. But your paper attempts to steer a third course between the two of them.
It says that...
Can you say more about that?
Well, if this is all based on the assumption that it makes sense to think of language in terms of some kind of optimization of linking of interface conditions. If that basically, if these ideas are wrong, then it's not going to go anywhere. But if there's something to those ideas, then both of the properties that you mentioned could turn out to be correct. That is, the interface conditions could have homologous structures in other, say, other primates. But the linking seems to be human unique. And the question is where that comes from. And if it turns out to be an optimization process, there are ways of thinking about it that don't involve the selectional leap that seems almost impossible to explain.
Say more about that. In the paper, you describe the interface conditions as interfaces between a cognitive system, cognitive intentional system, and a sensory motor system, with natural language forming a kind of bridge drawn between them at various points.
And that's what seems to be lacking in the cousins, other primates. They have no technique of, what's lacking, and this has been observed for a long time, is something like a recursive procedure that will permit that will generate sound meaning pairs in some sense over an infinite range. Well, if the sound meaning parts are the interface conditions, and the recursive procedure is an optimization procedure, then you've broken the topic of evolution of language into compartments, each of which can be investigated. I mean, most of their work is on the sensory motor systems, which they argue really don't have any particular unique adaptation in humans, at least not a major one. On the conceptual intentional side, it's much more questionable. There are questions of how animal systems signal and how human thought is expressed raise many questions. Not at all clear that the human mode of referring to things is at all related to animal signaling. That seems to have quite different properties. And that's just the beginning. Then you go on to more complicated things like, quantifier structures and so on and so forth that we don't even raise. But the real innovation in Homo sapiens appears to be the overwhelming one, is the recursive process of linking two kinds of information. One kind that feeds sensory motor systems, the other that interacts with conceptual intentional systems.
The human side, the human language makes, the bridge makes contact with the sensory motor system, and you said that has analogs in the animal world. Is that really
Maybe
correct?
Even homologs, which is different. Yeah, analogs are all over the place, but the question is whether there are really homologous structures that you might trace back to before the split between hominids and other primates, 5 million years ago or something like that.
Is that the idea then that the gestural system maybe of apes is the point at which language...
Well, actually they're talking about things like the articulatory and perceptual systems. The gestural systems is a different question. I mean, human gestural systems could turn out to be like other primate gestural systems.
But isn't that a crucial component? I mean, what we know, for example, about natural language is that, this is a point that you've emphasized in other interviews, is that it's not essentially vocal. That is, It's vocal, but it's also gestural, given the existence of sign language.
Yeah, that raises new dimensions, which we don't go into there. But is there anything, because it hasn't really been explored enough. I mean, to what extent are the gestural systems involved in sign and the gestural systems that we otherwise use seem to be dissociated? Actually, this has been demonstrated pretty persuasively, I think, in acquisition of sign. I mean, there are some dramatic cases, like Laura Petito's work on acquisition of the use of pronouns, first and second person pronouns in sign and spoken language. I mean, basically it works like this. There's a stage in spoken language development, normal, what we're used to, in which children invert you and I. So they'll say, pick you up, meaning pick me up. They regard you as, they hear you as referring to themselves, so they think that's who it is, and they hear I as referring to that person over there, so they think that's who it is, so they interchange. And then after a while, this goes away. It's a kind of a pretty standard, presumably maturational process that goes on. Well, Laura Petito found the same thing happens in sign at about the same age. And there it's quite striking because I and you are iconic. You is this and I is that. And the infants at the same age act counter-iconically. So it's not just abstract, you and I interchange, but that and that interchanges. Furthermore, it turns out that at the same period, they use this and this for pointing correctly. So they have the pointing system iconically. They have the linguistic system, which is counter-iconic, at the same stage at which spoken language children are inverting the pronouns. So it looks, that kind of evidence seems to suggest that gestural systems and linguistic systems, even though they may have the exact same motor element involved in them, are just different systems. They also seem probably to be neurally dissociated.
In the sense you could do brain studies that show they're activating different areas?
It looks like it, yeah. In fact, this is work done by Ursula Bellugi and Ed Klima and others at Salk Institute, which has been going on for, I guess, about 20 years now. They discovered, to everybody's surprise, that for signers, they began with aphasia studies. In fact, most of it still is aphasia. That for signers, the language faculty is still left hemisphere dominant, and it had been suspected it's probably right hemisphere dominant because it's visual, but it turns out to look very much like spoken language, despite the difference of modality. And they've also discovered something beyond that. I mean, discover is strong, these are hard things to do, but they have evidence that for both spoken language and sign, local analytic computation, like sentence structure, is left hemisphere specialized, but global computation, like discourse structure, is right hemisphere localized for both sign and spoken. At least that's what their evidence looks like. Imaging studies are just barely beginning. That should have shed more light on it.
Does that provide, as it were, neurological evidence that the sentence is a special sort of unit for linguistic computation? It's not, paragraphs are not just big sentences?
It provides, evidence to the, this is all pretty weak evidence because very little is understood about it, but it looks like that. And going back to the original question, this does raise serious issues about the ways in which the sensory motor system imposes critical conditions on the operations of the computational system, because it seems it's getting to be more and more plausible to believe that human language is not modality specific, even though it's overwhelmingly in the speech-hearing modality.
But that would put serious constraints on our ability to figure out when natural language evolved. For example, there's at least a 2-decade-old research program by Philip Lieberman, Jeffrey Laitman, collaborators, that has attempted to look at the comparative anatomy both of extant primates, their vocal tract anatomy, and also reconstruct the soft tissue anatomy of extinct hominids on the idea that basically if they couldn't make the sounds, they didn't have the language.
Yeah, that's pretty controversial. I mean, it looks as though, this is, again, I don't enter into this, I don't know anything about it, but Hauser and Fitch both are very skeptical about that, as are others. It seems that some of the properties that they found are all over the primate kingdom, and that it may be that hundreds of thousands of years ago, the hominids from which we're ultimately descended had the what look like the physical capacities to produce language. But your point is correct. If the speech-hearing modality is not critical to it, this would be significant, but not overwhelming. Like another organism could use sign.
Yeah, exactly. It could have existed
as
a great
humans
deal
do.
earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that does raise the question about a search for homologous structures in the sensory motor system. It should be extended, and we all know that, to asking whether what is the character of the gestural systems that are used for language as distinct from the gestural systems which are physically identical but that are part of a different system, gesturing.
How is that possible? I mean, how could it be possible to have two overlapping?
Well, take the pointing case. It's the most dramatic example, but there are others.
It's highly dramatic because we think, our intuition about sign language, obviously completely mistaken, is that it is somehow iconic.
Yeah. Somehow it is. Like, when a signer will set points in visual space and refer back to them. It's the anaphora system. But it does go through the periods which indicate that that even the physically identical gestures are somehow different if they're linguistic and non-linguistic. And the neurological evidence indicates the same. In fact, if you look more deeply at sign language, it supports the same conclusions. I mean, Petito's results are particularly dramatic because it's because of the counter-iconic usage and the parallel to the normal acquisition for speaking hearing children. But this is all fairly recent work. It's kind of developing fast and should settle out. It could turn out that the major constraints, interface constraints, for the computational system are on the conceptual intentional side, which makes the problem very hard because to study that independently of language is very difficult. I mean, it's hard to study thought except through the medium of language, which will beg the questions.
How, in principle, could we even approach that question?
Well, you can do it. I mean, there's studies of what are called the ape's theory of mind, or the pre-linguistic infant's theory of mind. I mean, at what point do, for example, is a factual question, do, say, other primates attribute something like beliefs to their other members of their species? Can they attribute false beliefs, for example? And there are ways of studying this. There's just some interesting recent published work reviewing it. A book by Ann and David Premack just came out, which reviews a lot of the material on this thing. It's called Original Intelligence or something.
So the major constraints actually might be on that side rather than the sensory motor system.
Well, unless something can be learned about by now a lot is known about the perceptual, the auditory and articulatory apparatus. Much less is known about the systems of gesture that are used in sign. What are their structural properties? How are they distinguished from other gestures and so on? But undoubtedly there's going to be something to be said about that. And that may impose the kinds of constraints that are similar to the ones we're more familiar with from articulatory and auditory systems. And in those systems, there's reasonably good evidence, I think. Again, for me, this is secondary. I only know it indirectly, but it looks to me like there's plausible evidence that the systems are not, in any crucial sense, human-specific.
You make a startling suggestion at the end of this article that even the recursive procedures, what you call the narrow faculty of language, the sort of core of it, specifically understood, might actually have been adapted or exapted, co-opted, from another system having to do with navigation. What's that idea?
Well, this goes back to old ideas. I mean, it's everyone knows that if you want to, if you take a mature organism, say, a person or a worm or anything you pick, and you ask about the factors that lead it to be what it is, there are many different factors. I mean, one is whatever effect experience had. Another is what is an expression of the genes. A third factor is how the laws of nature work. I mean, the laws of nature work in ways which permit certain kinds of development, not others. And exactly what the effect is of those constraints is not too well understood. It's a hard problem. Actually, it's a problem Turing worked on for a good part of his life. Classic work is by Darcy Thompson. There's more recent work by others. But there are many properties of organisms that seem to just be consequences of the way the laws of nature work, which is, in a sense, it's a truism, but to find the effect of those is hard. Well, we're talking about computational systems. And how would the laws of nature operate in these? Well, one might expect that the way they work is by imposing conditions of efficient computation, some sort of optimization conditions. And things like that are found throughout nature. So insect navigation seems to have optimization properties. As I mentioned, foraging seems to optimize. There's recent work suggesting that by Christopher Cherniak at the University of Maryland that the arrangement of the neural systems, at least in simple animals, he suggests beyond, may not be genetically programmed, but just be what he calls minimization of wire length. I mean, using the same procedures that engineers use when they try to get the best possible transistor. You just make what he calls the best of all possible brains. It just sort of turns out that way. The circulatory system seems to work similarly. It looks like there's some optimization in the way it sort of scatters around the body. And it's possible that these things are just deep natural laws. And somehow or other, here the step that took place is the step of linking the external conditions. And what could have happened is that as soon as that step was taken, let's link them, it immediately became optimal. And now comes the linguistic questions. To what extent can we show that the actual linguistic systems do have optimal properties? That's what the work in the minimalist program's involved with. And that's how the issue, that's how, at least for me and for, I think, my colleagues, the question of bringing the evolution of language to a stage where parts of it can be investigated, that's where it sort of comes together.
So recursion basically provided the link, but then there's an issue of optimizing the character of the link?
Right. So, for example, if the character of the link is the way I personally assumed it to be, say, 10 years ago, say the article that Howard Lasnik and I wrote summarizing what we thought was the state of the art. If it's like that, it's very far from optimal. I mean, there were all sorts of properties in the system, different levels that aren't interface levels, strange conditions, all sorts of things. And if that's the way the system actually works, it looks very far from optimal. But if you can demonstrate that those empirical assumptions were wrong, that there really are no levels other than the interface levels, and that the operations do reduce in some interesting sense to the one operation that comes free in a recursive system, namely
combining together.
Take two things you formed and make a bigger one. That comes free, and it can be internal or external. That yields what we call movement in an automatic way. And if you can show that that works by optimal conditions, like some of these probe-goal theories, well, okay, then it is a huge empirical question, but there's a task, and it's a question how far you can carry it out to see if you can show that all of the technology that's used in descriptive and explanatory work in linguistics can be shown to be an artifact, just a reflection of optimal computational procedures. It's a huge task, but there's been, I think, at least to me, some significant progress in it. To the extent that that can be carried out, you have a picture of the evolution of language, which is, to oversimplify it, as we do there, it would look like the following. and this is surely oversimplified, the interface systems are there pretty much independently of language. And you find them, something like them at least, in other organisms. And you can study their evolution by usual methods, comparative methods. Somewhere comes the step of saying, okay, let's link these. Then automatically comes optimization of the linkage, which is the recursive system that meets optimal conditions. And then you have this basic core of human language. And it may not have changed since then. I mean, that's, like the ideal. How close you can get to that is a good question. But if it's correct, then to get back to your original question, could well be that things that look as remote as insect navigation illustrate the principles that showed up in optimizing the link.
I see. It wasn't the link itself that was derived, but the optimization.
The link comes from somewhere. But, that's the way evolution works. I mean, if you look at, say, systems that respond to light, like the eye, or maybe in phototropic plants and so on, they got to come from somewhere. And it seems that where they came from was some stochastic process that introduced into a cell a class of molecules by accident, which happen to convert light into chemical energy, rhodopsin molecules. When they get into a cell, then you've got the basis for all systems that respond to light. Mm-hmm. But how that happened, wasn't by selection, it's just something that happened. And it could be that the linkage is something that happened. Once it's established, you turn to the laws of nature to determine how it should work.
There are a lot of puzzles on the question of not only how it happened, but when it happened. Yeah. So, for example, in the evolution of our own species, Homo sapiens, there's a great mystery surrounding a certain kind of explosive Big Bang development that occurred about 30,000 years ago. Yeah. We know that modern humans came in about 100,000 years ago, coexisted with other species like Neanderthals for maybe 60,000 years. And then suddenly there was this very dramatic change, apparently, in human culture. And some have speculated that it was the origin of language only 30,000 years ago that did it. Does that seem remotely plausible?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that, roughly in that range, maybe 30, 50,000 years, something like that, there was an explosive change in the degree of inventiveness of tools, of different kinds of symbolism, even of this magnificent artwork that you see in Lascaux and so on. But there's no evidence, as far as I know, for any physiological changes during the first 50,000 years. And it looks as if contemporary humans are genetically, almost identical, no matter when they separated from the original, small breeding group, maybe around 100,000 years ago. So it's a fair question, what happened in those first 50,000 years? It's one of the many mysteries.
And more than that, though, it would suggest that after that link was drawn, we were in some sense genetically distinct from other members of our own species, which would make it puzzling how language could have
unless
spread.
The fact, there's another possible, and this is all total speculation. Here's a possible scenario. Around 100,000 years ago, it was all sitting there in the brain. But then, establishing the link could have been like making the first tools, it just happens. The same sort of question arises about when early hominids began flaking stones to make tools, how'd they figure it out? Once it was done, it had enormous effects on the species. It opened up new sources of protein and so on and so forth, and all sorts of effects. But it happened somehow, we don't know how. And the ability to do it had already been there before it happened, obviously, otherwise it couldn't happen. Now, it's possible that the ability to make the link was there, say, 100,000 years ago, and it just maybe independently, in various separated groups, somehow it happened, like tool making. And once it happened, you've got language, and then they're all going to look alike, because they're all coming from the same genetic base.
So it lay fallow for 60,000 years?
Yeah, just how long did tool making lay fallow? Maybe millions of years, for all we know. And in fact, anything you look at, the same question is going to arise. I mean, it's kind of striking to us because we think about language, but you can really ask the same questions about every stage of tool production or any other cognitive capacity.
Well, Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.
Okay.
We're now going to take questions from our studio audience. Please step to the mic and ask your question.
You seem to be substituting the word optimization of the linking process or something like that for the process that others would say is guided by natural selection, more or less. And those others would say that natural selection is, or someday will be, adequate to explain the development of the human faculty of language. So I'm just wondering if you can explain why you think that natural selection isn't adequate or isn't an appropriate term to use here, and how it falls short as an explanatory device.
Well, I don't see any reasonable selectional procedure, mechanism that could have led to the development of an optimal linkage. And there are many aspects of organic growth where we know that selection is just not the factors that are involved. So if you look at, say, symmetry there's a lot of symmetrical structures in organism design. There are many, as I mentioned, optimization processes that take place. Take, say, the way proteins fold, something as simple as that. It's not a matter of natural selection, that's just the way the world works. And the way the world works affects the way organic entities work. So it's just an empirical, I mean, there's nothing, everyone agrees that natural selection is an important factor in evolution. But to try to sort out the effects of that factor is extremely hard, even in the most elementary systems we know anything about, because there are all sorts of other factors, like chemical and physical laws, and maybe mathematical principles of organization. So there's no kind of, a priori stand that you have to take and then argue against. The question is just to discover what it is. And here are some suggestions as to what it could be. If someone has some selectional ideas, fine, look at those. But they don't have any particular priority. Yeah.
Okay.
Good morning, Professor Tchomsky. I'm a biologist, and actually the question I have is sort of a follow-up to this one. When a biologist looks at something as complex as the FLN, the recursion device ostensibly is, the first two questions you ask is, what is it for, and what is it from? That is, what did it evolve from? And you've suggested that maybe it didn't evolve, or at least that's not the right way to look at it.
Well, it evolved, but the way
its
reduction
property
molecules getting into the
Right.
cell evolved. Well, it's also evolution.
So its properties, in other words, on that view, are more contingent on its function, its contemporary function, rather than its evolutionary origin.
Well, see, even that's misleading, because there's a factual question about what the function is. I mean, the usual assumption about language has been that its function is to facilitate communication.
Right.
This, I've never believed that, and this point of view takes a very different approach. It says the function, if you want to use the word, of language is to link interface conditions. And when you look, here it's just an empirical question, and when you look closely at the structure of language, I could mention some cases, I think what you find is that the computational system is apparently optimal with regard to linking the interface,
Right.
but is very non-optimal with regard to communication.
I see. So, but I actually have a specific question about its origin. So, there is a case to be made that animal minds evaluate contingent circumstances and control their purposeful motion in response to those, that those systems are in fact hierarchically nested and combinatorial. There's actually an argument to be made that that's true. That looks remarkably like the FLN. That looks remarkably like the recursion device. And if that's true, in turn, then it means that the properties of the recursion device, perhaps including some that look suboptimal for its function, are in fact like the bones in a bird's wing. They are historical accidents rather than functional properties of the system. Could you perhaps explore that just for a moment, whether you like or dislike that view?
There's a difference between hierarchical structure and recursion. There's all kinds of, take say the
Yeah.
birds and, the bones, and I got 5 fingers, another animal has 3, and so on. That's hierarchical structure, but it's not recursion. There's no recursive process that gives you an arbitrary number of fingers, each stage of which has particular significance. Remember, this recursion is not like, walking. I mean, you take 1 step and then 2 steps and then 3 steps. Every stage in the process has particular significance, determined significance at 2 interfaces. And that's something completely different than hierarchical structure.
Yeah, I was actually referring to things like Biederman's view of perception, for example, that it's inherently combinatorial and hierarchically nested. Do you like or dislike that view?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, in fact, maybe we could have gone into this. In fact, I mentioned it, that could be that the recursive systems, not only maybe they're connected with whatever's involved in insect navigation, but they could also be involved with what a lot of perceptual psychologists call the rules of vision. The rules that make you see some object, some presentation as a 3-dimensional object in motion. I mean, there's a pretty well understood by now computational procedure that determines that from very few presentations, like 3 tachistoscopic presentations, get you to see a rigid object in motion. Okay, there's some kind of principles involved in that, and it wouldn't be outlandish to assume that those were called rules of seeing, are similar in some way to whatever's going on here. I mean, look, this didn't come from nowhere. The question is where it came from, and in my view, an exciting and not implausible conclusion is that it just comes from the way nature works with computational systems, and therefore you're going to find it all over the place.
I guess if there's one more question, I'm really, again, as a biologist, struck by why linguists are, I'm not sure the word is hostile, but apparently indifferent to this question of what language is for. Biologists look at that and say that, look at language, look at its sophistication, and it's Paley's watch on a heath. It's a complex thing that can only ultimately be produced as a result of its adaptive consequences. The only apparent adaptive consequences are the ones we think that leap immediately to mind, that is exchange of information, cooperative exchange of information.
If that's what leaps to mind, it's just a mistake. I mean, just look at if you want to look at...
Well, it leaps to the mind of almost every biologist in the world, I must tell you.
Okay, but think about it for a second. I mean, when the notion of function is a very, loose and vague notion. We all know that. So what's the function of the skeleton? I mean, is it to keep you from falling into a puddle on the ground, or is it to store calcium, or is
well, if it's properly construed, it's not narrow. To ask what the function of a bird wing is a well-focused question.
Maybe, but if you actually look at the history of it, it's not so well-focused. The evolution of it, it's quite complicated. A lot of exaptation and so on and so forth. But the notion of what a function is a very vague notion. However, what is usually assumed, plausibly, is you can get some guide to what the function is by looking at the characteristic use. Okay,
yes.
Well, let's take the characteristic use of language. Characteristic use of language is for thought, not for communication. Almost all language use, close to 100%, is internal.
My understanding was that that's controversial. That is, in particular, that most thought is in fact not linguistic.
Oh, that's another question.
Yes.
There could be plenty of thought that's not linguistic, but I'm asking a different question. What's the use of language? Statistically speaking, it's almost all internal. If you want to check that, just introspect for a couple hours.
Well, but that's based on introspection. I could make the
It's
counter
based on observation.
Well,
But introspection is a kind of observation.
Yes, I
mean,
agree with
if
that.
we had an outside way of looking at introspection, we'd find the same thing.
But an equivalently plausible interpretation of that is that that appears to be true subjectively, because the purpose of language is to prepare our thoughts for the ultimate purpose of social communication.
Well, you can
It doesn't
say this
control thought in
you
the
can
sense
say
that...
this if you want, but now we're off way and out of
No,
space.
those are competing models that
they're
should be
not.
susceptible to test. Yeah,
all we know is the following, that the overwhelming use of language, close to 100%, is internal. And when you think about what that internal stuff is, it has very little to do with communication. Like you can spend half your life obsessing because somebody criticized you 10 years ago. You don't expect to communicate it, but that's the kind of thing that goes on your mind all the time. Or
Well,
you can think about
But
all
ostensibly,
kinds
you
of
were
things.
preparing for an inadvertent meeting with that person.
Who
are you
says?
not?
Maybe
It's an argument
maybe
you could
somebody
make.
died. I mean, it's just not. It's just factually
Well,
not
yeah.
correct. It's true.
It is
that
an
it's-
arguable point.
It's true that, look, everything's arguable, but the overwhelming evidence is that internal thought is playing some function for us.
Yeah.
You know, planning, agonizing, whatever we do with
Right.
it. And some tiny piece of it ends up as being communication. Incidentally, plenty of other things are involved in communication too. Now, you can always make up a story. That's one of the things about evolutionary fairy tale manufacturing.
Or about all of science. They're
Not
they're
all-
about stories, yes, they are.
Not
Testable
all-
stories,
not all of
hopefully.
science, just so stories are particularly prominent in this domain. But if you want to use plausible arguments, like characteristic use tells you something about function, then I think you'd have to say that the function of language in this loose sense is for thought. Some of it ends up being communication, very small parts. In fact, even the part that is externalized is communication, only in a very odd sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like if you meet somebody it's very hard for people to be next to each other and not to talk to each other.
Yeah.
It's kind of, it's like dogs looking at, another's eye. You just have to talk to each other. So if you meet you're standing with somebody at a bus stop, it's just uncomfortable if you're not talking to them. So you talk to them about the weather or the baseball game or something. That's not communication. That's just, it's sometimes called phatic communication. It's just a way of establishing human relations.
Social.
But that's not communication in the sense of transmitting information or anything. If by communication you just mean interacting with other people, well, yeah, okay. Then it would turn out, if you do it descriptively, I think it would turn out like this. Overwhelmingly, language is internal. I mean, it's literally close to 100%. Some of it is externalized. Of the part that's externalized, a lot of it is just phatic communication, meaning we want to be part of a group, or we don't want to feel hostile to each other. Like you don't look at a person, you don't like gaze is always off to the side, or you stay at a certain distance from somebody, and that sort of thing. A lot of it just seems to be like that, and some very small part of it is communication in some independent sense of the word communication.
So
you can make up a story saying that it's that very small part that drives the system, but we have no evidence for it. Furthermore, if you look at the mechanics of the system, now we're getting into more technical aspects. I think you can show that a lot of the mechanics of the system are badly designed for communication and well designed for linking the interfaces. Actually, one important case of this, which is, if any of you are writing parsing programs, programs where you're trying to do automated parsing, there's one overwhelming problem that you always face. And that is a word comes along like a WH word, what or something like that. And because of the way language works, that it's going to be linked to some position in the sentence. But that position happens to be not heard, to gap. So you have the problem of taking a word who and figuring out what unexpressed, there's no space, there's no break, there's no nothing, but what point in the utterance is it connected with? Just think how easy it would be if you repeated it. So if you didn't say, what did you see, but what did you see what? Okay, then the problem's trivial. However, that's computationally more difficult. If you look at the way our beliefs about the computational systems, if they are recursive as in the way we think, that would involve more computation for linking the interfaces. So here's a pretty striking case, and there are quite a lot more, where the system seems to be mechanically designed so that it reduces computation and increases the problem of perception. And I think there are a lot of cases like that.
Susan? Thank you.
It's very interesting to hear how language may have evolved as a response to the interface conditions between intentionality and sensory motor systems. And so we've been talking about the past 100,000, 30,000, whatever, in terms of our time course. What about the future? Are we done? Is the language mechanism now finished? Is this the masterpiece, or are we going to continue to adapt?
There's no relevant evolution going on. I mean, there's some, humans are change all the time. Different groups change, but the time scale is so small that the chances of significant genetic change involving something like the language faculty look pretty marginal.
But even in another 100,000 years, can you envision?
So little is known about this that you can say anything you like. But the chances, I think most biologists would agree that we're just talking about much too small a time scale.
So everyone will speculate about the past.
Furthermore,
No
there's
one will
all kind of
speculate about the
interbreeding,
future.
don't forget. You know, there's no, I mean, for real changes to take place, there have to be separation of species. They have to stop, of subspecies. You have to stop interbreeding for a long time before speciation takes place, real genetic change. And how that happens is mostly mysterious, but it does seem to require a pretty sharp break in interbreeding
Right.
over a long stretch. And that just doesn't happen with humans.
Right. So perhaps we could use simulation to try to explore some of these ideas, since we really can't do it in the real world too easily.
Wait for
Won't
space
speculate.
travel.
But
Okay.
you could do simulation if you understood the processes. But since you don't understand the processes, you can't do simulation.
Thanks.
Just a short question on the role of the sensory motor interface, because in the earlier discussion, it seemed as though what was crucial about the combinatorial system and so on is that it made the link between these two things, and the output of the sensory motor interface is, as you have been saying, so some kind of physical event, either
Sound.
hand motion or sounds or something. And if language is sort of making that link between, say, the inside and the physical world, then in the response to the earlier question about, say, the function of language as being a vehicle for expressing thought, then it raises the question of what's the other half of the link in the 100% use or almost 100% use of language as you described. This what's at the other end of the link, the other end of the previous end of which is the conceptual motor or conceptual interface
It's
system.
an extremely interesting question, and here we don't have anything in the way of solid evidence, but we have a ton of introspective evidence, and that's evidence. All right, introspect for a while. When you're talking to yourself, you're producing something which is the same as what you hear. Okay?
Yeah, I mean,
And that's an enormous amount of our life, is producing to ourselves something that in our head sounds just like something we're hearing. Here's a question which I don't know the answer to, and I don't think it's been investigated. Do signers
that was
visualize?
the next question.
Well,
Was,
I don't think it's been investigated, but I would assume so. If that's the case, then the internal part of the sensory motor system is really functioning.
Okay, so this
I think it's very hard to talk to yourself and not do
Use
it in a
language,
sense of English.
right.
you know?
Okay. Yeah, so this is, I mean,
In fact, you can
earlier
look, when you're
opinions about
talking to
thoughts
your,
as
when you're talking
self-vocalizations
to
might come in
yourself,
here,
you can
right.
figure out if the sentences rhyme, for example.
True enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these
Okay.
things are easy. In fact, automatic.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks very much.
Okay.